The legacy of the Clone Wars conflict brought almost the entirety of the galaxy into war with one another, where allegiances fluctuated, lines were drawn, and the war brought forth the worst aspects of the galaxy and the inhabitants within. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Clone Wars is that although the galaxy was conditioned to build allegiances, and were unwittingly pitted against each other with many innocent bystanders caught in the middle, though evil was rife throughout the conflict, with the likes of Palpatine and Grievous particularly working on especially dark agendas. Many of the premier antagonists throughout the Clone Wars were not in fact evil at all, but may have been some sort of tragic figure within Star Wars lore. In particular, the story of Asajj Ventress is particularly saddening, and though she was widely perceived as a brute force of anger and unbridled dark side rage, few were able to see past this facade. One Jedi Master in particular could see beyond this mask, and slowly began to uncover Ventress's true motivations, and this master was none other than the famed Jedi General, Obi-Wan Kenobi. So stick with us, weary travelers of the galaxy, and let's explore how Kenobi's view of Ventress evolved throughout the course of the Clone Wars conflict, and how Ventress was ultimately driven to the dark side out of sheer necessity and survival. At the beginning of the war, Kenobi wouldn't be faulted for falling into a similar belief system as the rest of the Jedi Order as it pertained to Ventress. As a former Jedi Padawan who had succumbed to her anger and fallen under the teachings of Dooku, there seemed to be little more to her public perception than a Sith assassin who was trained under the leader of the Separatist movement. Many Jedi simply perceived Ventress as a dangerous, angry, dark Jedi, with nothing more to her than the motives of the Sith. They perceived her as a pawn, but a powerful pawn at that. A pawn with the abilities of a bishop, able to contend with Jedi Masters on a whim, and therefore they decided that they need to put her down. However, Kenobi shared a different belief about the Dark Jedi. The Jedi's perception of Ventress came as the product of the Jedi Order's increasingly dogmatic principles and viewpoints, believing that anyone who fell to the dark side was automatically evil in nature and deserved no forgiveness nor mercy. Their ideologies led to many of their knights and masters simply dismissing her as a force for evil, rather than looking at the more in-depth reasoning behind Ventress's actions. Kenobi, however, came to learn of Ventress as an individual, even going so far as to form uneasy alliances with her for short durations of time. Having this type of prolonged exposure to Ventress allowed him to see her story unfold up close, and allowed him to have a very different perspective on the fallen Jedi, and his connection with the Force only served to assist him in his more flexible viewpoint on Ventress. He was able to sense that there was more emotional complexity than a blind drive of irrational rage, but there was an underlying sense of fear that plagued Ventress in her every move. Over the course of the war, Kenobi was slowly able to deduce more and more about the Sith assassin, and discovered that her actions were not led by anger, nor were they driven by the orders of her master, but a latent, inherent fear of the galaxy as a whole. Kenobi began viewing Ventress as a lost child, and refused to strike down an innocent of the galaxy, believing that this was staunchly against the Jedi's beliefs. Her fear led her to wear a defensive mask and approach to life ready for combat at every turn, believing that violence was the only solution that would always be reliable. And based on her previous life experiences, this perception makes a saddening amount of sense for the character. Having been enslaved at a young age by Mother Talzin, Ventress had no sense of normalcy or security going back to the very beginnings of her life, as her childhood had been subject to immense physical as well as psychological torture. When she was finally able to escape this lifetime of servitude, the conditions that she found herself in immediately following this encounter were not much better. Much like Anakin, she was pulled from a life of slavery and inducted into the Jedi Order, which carried with it its own set of mental and psychological tribulations. Though on the surface her life got better and she was in the healthier home, just beneath the surface, her mental state continued to worsen over time. Instead of being able to properly work through her trauma, she was taught to repress these feelings, bottling them up as her mental state continued to steadily deteriorate. Not to mention, Ventress would never be officially claimed by the Jedi Order, as again, just like Anakin, she was never officially inducted into the Order, her master instead choosing to take her on as an apprentice without the will of the Council. The similarities between Anakin and Ventress are actually very apparent and strong. Upon the death of her master, not only was she pushed into the darkness, but she was forced into yet another environment that was wrought with immense physical conflict and an innate fear of being killed. This took the form of a gladiatorial arena run by the very same pirates who had executed her master, Kai Narek, where she spent another portion of her life enslaved and forced to fight for her very survival. Ventress had quite notably never had a stable environment with a reliable sense of safety and security, instead being passed around from one hellscape to another, ultimately pulled on the power of the dark side as a desperate, last-ditch means of survival. She tapped into the darkness not because she wanted to, nor because she saw it as a means of power or control, but simply as a last resort, a final necessity in order to survive. Once she had adequately embraced the power that she could feed with her fear and anger, Dooku found her and deemed her to be a worthy apprentice of the dark side, leading directly into the Clone Wars conflict where she was trained in the ways of the dark side by Dooku himself. Still taught nothing but fear, but now she had power. Ventress, however, never had a choice. After spending her life circulating between the darkest corners of the galaxy, she developed a fear for what would come next, and Kenobi was able to sense this fear that clouded Ventress's mind. He didn't see an angry dark Jedi, he saw a lost child. She then ensured that she would always be ready for a fight, even though this oftentimes took the form of Ventress striking first for her very own safety, as she had never understood what it meant to trust anyone. Everyone became her enemy, and in order to survive, she turned to a philosophy of striking first and asking questions later, all of which were directly fed by her fear. Kenobi, however, came to learn about this, and came to understand Ventress on a deeper level, much more personal level than any of his colleagues in the Jedi Order ever would, even more than Dooku ever would, even going so far as to compare her to Anakin during his exile on Tatooine after the rise of the Empire. Obi-Wan Kenobi always had a soft spot for Asajj Ventress in his heart. He never perceived Ventress as an enemy, even though Ventress perceived everyone as an enemy. And Obi-Wan was perhaps the only individual that saw who Ventress really was behind her dark facade. Behind all the fear and the abandonment and the exile, Kenobi was the only individual that understood or even cared for Asajj Ventress. But anyway, my friends, what do you think of this more in-depth explanation of Ventress's psyche? How do you feel about Ventress as a character, and would you like to see more of her in the future? As always, my friends, thank you guys so much for watching the channel. If you like these in-depth explanations about characters, please like the video, as that lets us know that you want to see more. As always, my friends, may the Force be with you, and I hope you have a great day.